All right, last week we did 12 chapters and 25 years in one sermon. That's nothing. This week we are doing 4 books of the Bible and like 125 years in 30 minutes. So this is all a lead up to us studying spiritual gifts. The idea that each one of us has been given at least one gift by the Holy Spirit for the purpose of building and edifying the church. And so I think in the lead up to that, we're looking at the fact that God has called very imperfect people throughout the course of history to come and serve him, to lead his people, to give us a little bit of courage as we study those gifts. Because I think so often we are so well acquainted with our own failures and our own shortcomings that it's hard for us to look and say, maybe God is calling me to do something too. Last week we looked at Abraham. This week we're looking at Moses. The story of Moses starts at the beginning of Exodus. The people of Israel have been in captivity for about 430 years, about 400 years at this point. And they're growing exponentially. They're growing in number so much that Pharaoh has decided that they need to be controlled, that their numbers getting so great that if Egypt were ever attacked, that the Israelites would most likely side with the enemy, fight against the Egyptians and wipe them out. So he decides to lower their number, that he's going to order that all baby boys born to the Hebrews or the Israelites be killed. He gives this order to all of the people. He gives it to the midwives. And there's a few here and there who choose not to obey. One of those that chose not to obey were the mother and father of Moses. They took him, and seeing that he was a fine child, they decided to protect him. They kept him back for about 3 months, trying to hide him and care for him. But realizing that they couldn't go on doing that forever, they take a basket and they line it with pitch, and they put the baby in the basket, and they put a cover over the top, and they set it out on the Nile, thinking maybe the miraculous could happen. Maybe the God of all creation could draw him out of the water and save him in a way that they were powerless to do. Well, Moses' sister Miriam is kind of scooting along the banks of the Nile, watching this basket go to and fro, and sees as it gets caught in the reeds right by where the daughter of Pharaoh is coming to bathe, she and her attendants. And one of them sees this basket out there and goes to see what it is and opens it up and finds a little Hebrew baby in it and brings it to the princess. And she decides that she wants to raise this baby as her own. And at that point in time, Miriam, Moses' sister, kind of scoots out and says, would you like me to go find a Hebrew woman for you to raise him, to feed him, and all this stuff? And princess is like, that's a great idea. So Miriam goes, gets her own mother, Moses' mother, brings her to the princess, and she says, I would like to pay you to raise this child. Isn't that every parent's dream? Like somebody wants to pay you to do your own job. So she actually gets to raise Moses in infancy up until he becomes about a toddler, and then he goes into the palace of Pharaoh, raised by Pharaoh's daughter. And he grows up in the Egyptian ways and the Egyptian cultures, but somehow knows that he's connected to the Hebrew people, knows that the Egyptian ways he's being raised in are not his own. And one day he leaves the palace and he goes out to see the plight of his people. He's heard it, but he hasn't seen it for himself. So he goes out and he sees the forced labor that they're in. He sees how they're mistreated. And in one particular instance, he sees how one slave master is just mercilessly beating this Hebrew slave. And no one's coming to his aid. No one's doing anything to save him. And Moses looks this way and that way, and seeing nobody around, he pulls the Egyptian off him and kills him and then buries him in the sand. Moses saw injustice and decided he needed to do something to right it, even though it wasn't the right way to go about doing it. Well, a couple days later, Moses comes back out and he sees 2 Hebrews fighting each other. And he says, brothers, this is not to be done. This isn't how you're supposed to treat each other. And they say to him, what? Are you going to kill one of us just like you did the Egyptian? And Moses at that point in time realizes he's been found out. And he knows it's just a matter of time before this word gets to Pharaoh and his own life is going to be taken from him. So in panic, he runs. He runs out into the desert all the way to a place called Midian. And when he gets out to Midian, he rests next to a well and he sees a couple of shepherd girls being hassled by these shepherd men who won't let them come and water their flocks. So Moses chases off these men, opens up the well for these ladies, and then waters all of their flocks while they wait. They run home and tell dad about the situation, and the father invites him in, makes him a part of their household, gives him his daughter Zipporah to marry him, and basically makes him a part of the family business, makes Moses a shepherd. For 40 years, Moses spends time shepherding his flock, spends time with Jethro's family. Jethro was a priest of God in Midian, so he probably taught his son Moses the ways of God as well. Towards the end of that 40 years that Moses spends in the desert with his flock, he notices a unique phenomenon that happens. There's a bush that bursts into flames, which probably isn't all that unique given the heat and intensity of the desert. But the thing that he notices about this particular bush isn't just that it's on fire, but that it's been on fire for a while. It doesn't burn up. It's just the fire is ongoing and the bush is not consumed. So Moses' curiosity gets the better of him, and he goes out to see what's going on. He gets there, and he hears the voice of God saying, "Moses, take off your sandals, for the place that you are standing is holy ground." So he takes off his sandals, and God speaks with him. He says, "Moses, I have heard the cry of the Israelites. I know that they are suffering, and I have come down to set them free. And I have picked you to be my chosen instrument to go to Egypt, to speak to Pharaoh, to tell him, set my people free." This should be good news. But instead, Moses is not pleased with getting this word. He's scared. He's like, who am I, of all people, to go to Pharaoh? And you're thinking to yourself, of course you're the perfect person to go to Pharaoh. You were raised in the palace. You know the Egyptian ways. You know the culture. You have been specially selected from the time you were born for this job. But he won't see it at all. He is blind to his ability and his circumstances and the way God has orchestrated this. He instead is so focused on his perceived inability. He says, "Lord, I have not been eloquent of speech any time in my past, nor in like the 5 minutes we've been talking, and I don't think I'm the right person for this job." But God says to him, who is it that created the man's mouth? Who is it that makes a person be able to speak or mute, deaf or dumb? I am the one who does that, and I am the one telling you, you are going to go to Pharaoh and you're going to set my people free. And Moses comes back to him again. He says, God, I think you need to find somebody else. I'm just not the right person. That doesn't go over well with God. God gets angry with Moses. He says, I made your mouth, I orchestrated your circumstances, and what's more, I am going with you. And you're telling me find somebody else. But how often do we do that same thing in our life? God has orchestrated our circumstances. He's put people in our life for us to share the gospel with, to love, to build relationship with, to befriend, to usher into the kingdom. And we're saying, God, you've got to send somebody else. I can't possibly be the right person. I only have every class with this person. I only live next door to them. I only do business with them all the time. There's got to be somebody else. But we fall into that same doubt trap of somebody else will be better suited for this. The truth of the matter is there's probably somebody else who's better suited, but God has picked you. God has picked us to be those individuals. And so the circumstances are irrelevant at that point in time. So Moses and God go back and forth, and finally God says, I will send your brother with you, your brother Aaron, and he will be your mouthpiece. You'll be like God to him, and he'll be the prophet. So I will speak to you, tell you what needs to be said to Pharaoh. You tell Aaron, and then Aaron will tell Pharaoh. So Moses very reluctantly agrees. He goes back home to Jethro, and he says, hey, I'm thinking I'm going to take the family. We're going to go back to Egypt, and we're going to see if any of my people are left. Jethro says, the Lord be with you. Go. So they head out. But Moses was reluctant before he went. He had questions for God at the burning bush. He said, they're probably going to ask me what your name is, and I don't even know what your name is. What is your name? And God tells them, tell them I am who I am sent you. And he says, all right, so I'll go. I'll tell them your name. But what if they don't believe me that I've actually met with you, that you're the one sending me? And so he says, I'm going to give you a couple things to do. First, take the staff in your hand, your shepherding staff, and I want you to throw it on the ground. So he throws it on the ground. Immediately, it turns into a snake. And Moses, being my kind of guy, runs away. And then he comes back, and he grabs it by the tail, and it turns back into a staff. And God says, they'll believe it when they see this. But in case they don't, I want you to take your hand and I want you to put it inside your robe and pull it back out. And when he pulls it back out, it's leprous. It's white like snow. And then God said, now take it and put it back in your robe one more time. And he brings it back out and it's back normal pink-colored flesh. He says if they don't believe the first, they'll believe the second. And in the off chance they don't believe the second, what I want you to do is I want you to take some water from the Nile and I want you to pour it on the ground and it's going to turn into blood. Then they will believe you. So Moses gathers his family and they set out. And he's very shy, reluctant, scared. I mean, all the things you can think of that are going to happen when you're going to confront a mighty and powerful king and you are asking for his entire workforce to be sent away. So he goes and his brother Aaron, sent by God to him, meets him along the way and they explain the game plan. They go together to the elders of the people of Israel and they say, I am who I am sent me to let you know he's heard your cry. That after 430 years of bondage, he's coming to set you free. He cares, he hears, he sees what's going on, and he has sent me as his vessel to come and free you. And he shows them the signs, and the elders all bow down and they worship God, thinking for so long he hasn't heard our circumstances. For so long we thought we were alone. But actually all this time he was hearing us, and finally he has come to act. So Moses and Aaron go to Pharaoh and they say, let my people go. We just want to go out into the desert for a little while. We want to worship. And Pharaoh's like, I don't even know this God that you're talking about. These Hebrew people have way too much time on their hands if they're concocting this crazy story. I'm going to make life a little bit harder on them. So I'm going to make them keep their same quota of bricks that they have to make every day, but I'm going to make them go and get the straw themselves. So he's increasing their workload exponentially right off the bat. But Moses does a first miracle for him of turning the Nile into blood, and Pharaoh is not impressed because his dark magicians can do the same thing. So things for the Hebrew people get worse before they get better. God has come, he's heard their plight, their situation, and they're all excited, but then they see that instead of being miraculously set free immediately, what God does is he hardens Pharaoh's heart and the situation gets worse. And so many times in the process of escaping bondage, in the process of leaving sin behind, of being set free, it's not a linear path that things constantly get better. It is, things get worse as the enemy tries to swoop in, and God continually brings you out into the path of freedom. So immediately the Hebrews get upset, their foremen get upset at Moses and Aaron. Look at what you're doing to us. We had a bad deal already, and now you've made it even worse by increasing keeping the quota of bricks the same, but we have to go get the straw ourselves. So Moses and Aaron come back a few days later, and they say, again, let my people go. And they go through a series of plagues, a series of Moses asking for the people to be set free, Pharaoh saying no, Moses saying then this is what God is going to do. And they repeat the cycle 10 times. The first time it was turning the Nile to blood. The second time it was bringing out frogs and covering the land with them, even inside their homes. Then it was gnats. The dust of the earth was turned into gnats and just covering everything. After that it was flies. Then the majority of their livestock died. Then it was boils over the remaining livestock and the Egyptians themselves. After that it was a plague of hail which wiped out the majority of their crops, and then followed by the locusts who came and devoured what remained. After that, it was the plague of darkness, which was a darkness that lasted for several days, and it was a tangible darkness affecting only the Egyptians' portion of Egypt and not the land of Goshen that the Hebrews lived in. And then finally, it was the plague of the firstborn, the Passover. Pharaoh's heart had continued to be hardened against the request to let the people of Israel go. And so the plague of the firstborn came, or the Passover, where every firstborn child in Egypt or in Israel that didn't celebrate the Passover was killed. And when that happened, Pharaoh called Moses in the middle of the night and said, take your people, get out of here. You're a stench in my sight. And God enabled the Israelites to plunder the Egyptians by going and asking all of their neighbors as they were on their way out of town, hey, do you have any gifts you would like to give us? And so they gave them riches. They gave them gold and silver and fine linens and all these different things. So in that way, they plundered the Egyptians without even going to war against them. They're on their way out of town with all of their belongings, and they hit the Red Sea when Pharaoh's heart changes and realizes, we've just let our entire workforce go. Like, we had about 1 million slaves, 1 million people, and we just let them all go for nothing. So he gathers together his army, pursues the Israelites, and when the Israelites see the army coming towards them, they grumble and they complain to Moses. Why in the world would you bring us out of Egypt only to kill us here? Is God out for us? Does he hate us? Why is he doing this? And Moses tells them, you need to stand firm and you need to see God working here. And so Moses calls out to God. God tells him to part the sea. He parts the sea. They get across. Pharaoh's army pursues and he closes down the sea on top of them, wiping out Pharaoh's army. The people are free on the other side. They're excited. They're worshiping. But that doesn't last very long. See, moving 1 million people through the desert is a logistical nightmare. Like, to sustain all of our military operations in the desert, we have daily convoys of all these massive trucks bringing water, bringing food, bringing extra needed items. They had nothing like that. There was no like Goat Express bringing stuff to them. They were on their own. And so natural needs began to arise. If you're in the desert, you need water. And if you're traveling for any significant distance, you need food. And so rather than seeing the hand of God mightily move over all of these plagues and setting them free finally, they constantly turn back to this question of, God, are you against us? And by proxy, that was always put upon Moses because Moses was God's mouthpiece at that point in time. Moses, why did you bring us out here? Moses, was it bringing us out here for the purpose of killing us, for allowing us to die of dehydration or die of starvation? Are you really so evil that you would do that? And so time and time again, Moses responds in the same way. He falls down on his face and he prays to God. The very thing that the Israelites should have done. And if they didn't do it in the beginning, they surely should have seen the pattern of what Moses would do and how God would respond and started doing that themselves, but they didn't. And so Moses cries out to God, God, we need water. What do you want me to do? And God brings forth water. And then the people cry out that they are hungry. And God brings them food too. He starts with manna, this special wafer-thin, honey-flavored bread that would appear on the ground every day, enough for 1 million people to eat every single day. So the people are eating that for several months, and then they desire meat. You know, back in Egypt, we had meat. Moses, we don't have meat out here. And so Moses cries out to the Lord again, and God brings quail. Not just a few quail so everybody can have a little bit. He brings a month's worth of quail. So for an entire month, that's what they eat. He says, you want meat? I'm going to give you so much meat that by the end of this, you're going to be sick of it. It's going to be coming out your nostrils. So God continually provides for the people, but also at the same time has a very firm stance against the sin of the people and their grumbling attitude. Moses, on the other hand, is very humble in the way that he accepts the complaints from the people and continually intercedes to God on their behalf. They come to another situation where they are in need of water and the people are grumbling again. Why did you bring us out here to kill us? And Moses cries out to God, and God says, take your staff, the one that you changed into a snake before, the one that you parted the sea with. I want you to go up on this rock with the elders of Israel, and I want you to strike it. And water's going to come pouring forth. So he brings the elders of Israel, strikes the rock, water pours forth, and there's enough for all the people and their flocks to drink. But the problem with the miraculous is so often we are short-term in memory. They would forget that God has continually miraculously supplied all of their needs, and all they need to do is cry out to him. But instead, they choose the easy work of grumbling and complaining and getting on Moses' case about everything. But at every turn, Moses has been tremendously gracious to them. What's more is he spends day after day sitting in judgment over them. If they had any situation that came up that needed to be settled, they came to Moses. And so Moses had a super long line every day From morning till night, that was all he did. And his father-in-law, Jethro, comes to visit, and he says, Moses, this isn't the way to do it. He says, you're going to get worn out and tired, and you're never going to be able to do what only you can do. So what I want you to do is I want you to find men who are trustworthy, men who can render a good decision, and I want you to put them in charge of people to be their judges. And then if there's any case too strong or too difficult, then send them to you. But in the meantime, let these other people take care of this stuff. Moses' humility extended to his ability to be able to take input from other people. Despite the fact that he was the person front and center, didn't mean he had to be the person with all the answers. He was willing to take his father-in-law's input, put it into practice, and see that this guy actually really knew what he was talking about. As they make their way through the desert, they come to Sinai, or to Mount Horeb, the very mountain where Moses had his first encounter with God with the burning bush. And God appears on the mountain with fire and with cloud and with smoke and with trumpet blasts, and has Moses come up and receive the 10 Commandments. He spends 40 days and 40 nights with God. He comes down with the law of God to give to the people, only to find out that in his absence, they have prostrated themselves to a foreign god. They've come to Aaron, who was Moses' right hand at the time, and said, this fellow Moses, we don't even know where he's gone. He's been gone so long. We need a God who is going to lead us. So Aaron tells them, bring me all of your gold earrings from you and your kids, and I'm going to melt them down, and I'll make us a God. So the idea here wasn't that they were trying to have a foreign God. It's that they were trying to fashion this idol into the same God who brought them out of Egypt. Because he was mighty and powerful and had done great things, but because they couldn't see him, they wanted the comfort of having some statue or representation of him. Moses comes down, sees what they've done, is furious that they would be unfaithful to God so quickly. So he takes the statue, grinds it up into powder, puts it on the water, and makes them all drink it so they could realize how horrible this actually was, that what they had been bowing down to had now made its way through their digestive tract and was in the latrine, that they could see what it really was that they were doing. Moses, in his anger, throws down both of the tablets and has to go back up to the mountain again for another 40 days and 40 nights, where God miraculously sustains him without food and without water and receives the second giving of the law. He comes down, he gives it to the people hear what he has to say, and they agree. This is the way to do things. We will abide by this. They go out further in the desert, and what becomes clear is the way that Moses interacts with God. Moses interacts with God as a person coming to a friend with a situation. Not kind of a hey buddy buddy type thing, but a free exchange of communication that up until that point in time was completely foreign to them. It said that God met with Moses like a friend meets with their friend face to face. Now, Moses never actually saw the face of God because it would have killed him, but the presence of God was there and met with him in the tent of meeting on a continual basis. Whenever God had something to say to him, he would draw him to the tent of meeting and meet with him there. For a period of time, they wander through the desert until they get to the edge of the promised land. They're there. They can see parts of it at a distance. And the people think it would be a good idea to send out some spies. Let's go out and see what this land really entails, what we're coming up against. So Moses agrees with their assessment, sends out 12 spies to go and look at the land for 40 days and come back and give a report. The spies who come back, they say the land is fantastic. The produce, unlike anything we've ever seen. It's flowing with milk and honey, but the problem is there are people there so large and enemies so well fortified and cities so strong that I don't think we would ever be able to take them. There were only 2 that came back with a good report, Caleb and Joshua. But the people listened to the 10 and they melted with fear. Moses was unable to bring them back to the faithfulness of God, and they begged to go back to Egypt. The wrath of God was poured out on the people. Moses tries to intercede as he had before. When they had the golden calf, Moses went up and he said, Lord, if you won't forgive them, would you blot me out of the book of life? And God told him the way he was dealing with the people is if they sinned, they died. Each person for their own actions. See, Moses tried to go the route of Christ, to be a substitutionary atonement, to be the one whose life was spilled for the saving of all people, but he was unable to do that because he wasn't sinless. So God said each person will be treated according to their deeds. So when this happens and they refuse to go into the promised land because they're too scared and they want to try to go out to Egypt, God causes a plague to break out and kills thousands of the people. Moses and Aaron again intercede, but they're at a place where how do we move forward now? God meets with Moses and tells him because of the people's unbelief, they're going to spend 40 years wandering in this desert. Now, that wasn't what Moses had signed up for. Moses signed up for go and talk to Pharaoh, let my people go right into the promised land. And now, because of no fault of his own, his tour of duty was being extended by 40 years. 40 years of aimless wandering the desert with this grumbling, quarrelsome people who were never satisfied and never learned the lesson of crying out to God, but instead learned the lesson of backbiting and complaining. 40 years with them, not because of a sin he committed. He tells the people this, and their response is, maybe we can undo this. And so many of them charge into the promised land and promptly get their butts kicked all the way back to the desert. Many laying died. And they realized the only way they had moving forward was through God's plan. And God's plan was for them to wander aimlessly for 40 years. During that 40 years in the desert, Moses dealt continually with the people crying out, not to God, but at Moses because of perceived failures in his ability to lead, perceived abilities in his failure to provide what they wanted. For 40 years, he endured that. But it wasn't just the people. He had a group of leaders on the council come to him and say, basically, we think the way you and Aaron are doing this are all wrong. The people should have a greater voice. And God has to choose between Moses and Aaron and these 250 men. And through a series of two judgments, one where he wipes out the 250 with fire, and the other where he takes these other three and their families and swallows them up with the earth, shows that God has given his favor to Moses and Aaron. At another point in time, Moses even has to deal with betrayal in his own circle, where his brother Aaron and his sister Miriam start to speak against Moses because of his wife. And so he couldn't even trust his most trusted people. He dealt with betrayal and those who would turn at him at every point in time. The only person who was faithful to him throughout the entire time was his assistant, Joshua, who he would raise up to be the next leader of Israel. For 40 years, he endures the people. For 40 years, he tries to meet their needs. For 40 years, he endures their grumbling and their complaining without fighting back. And the 40 years were almost completed. They were in either the 38th year or the 39th year. And Moses had just been having a really hard year. His sister Miriam had died. The stress of being in the desert had gotten so great, and the people were just relentless in their complaints. And they come and they complain again, no water, no water, no water. And Moses had just had it up to here. And he goes before God, and God says, I want you to take your staff, and I want you to go to this rock, and I want you to speak to the rock, and the water will pour out from the rock. And Moses goes with Aaron, and he says, you insolent, rebellious people, must we bring water from this rock? And he takes his stick and he hits it, and he hits it again, and water flows from the rock. But the problem was he didn't do it the way God had asked him to do it. He didn't do it the way God had told him to do it. And what he demonstrated was a lack of faith, a lack of trust in what God was telling him to do. He let his emotions get the best of him. And I think each one of us can say we've had a point in time in our life when our anger, our frustration, our lack of trust in what God was doing has gotten the better of us, and we have lashed out in a similar way. After everything Moses had done for God up until this point, you would think God would give him a pass. You know what, Moses? I understand how stiff-necked these people are. I understand how rebellious they have been. I understand what kind of difficult situation you have been in. You get a pass. But that isn't what God has done, or that isn't what God did, and that wasn't what God had done for anybody else up until that point. So God tells Moses, because you didn't consider me holy in front of the people, because you didn't obey me, Moses, you and Aaron aren't going into the promised land. That's what he signed up for. Take the people out of captivity through the desert into the promised land. And now, because of this sin, because of his lack of faithfulness in this one situation, God was telling him, Moses, no promised land for you. And it seems harsh on this side of the cross, on this side of grace, to see somebody like that go down in flames because of one failure. But that's what God did. Moses continually came to God in prayer, saying things like, God, the more I've gotten to know you, the more amazing I think all of this is, and how beautiful that you say the promised land is. What do you think about me crossing over and going to the promised land when we get there? And God finally told him, Moses, enough. We are not talking about this anymore. I have told you you're not going into the promised land, and I don't want to hear anything more about this matter. He got so close within about a year and a half of getting to the promised land when he failed. Aaron died shortly after. Moses continued to lead the people for the remainder of that year to year and a half until they got to the River Jordan. But Moses was at a crossroads in his life. The very thing he most wanted had been taken from him, going into the promised land. We think about the very thing we most want, something that we feel like God is holding back from us, and we think about what does that do to us inside. We want a broken family to be whole. We want health. We want wealth. We want prosperity. We want our business to do well. We want our kids to do well. We want to have a hope for a future. But Moses' was wiped out in that moment. It would have been very easy for him to turn and to blame the Israelites. You know, if you guys had just done what you were supposed to do in the very first place, we would have been in the promised land 38 years before this, and none of this would have ever happened. It's easy to shift the blame, to shift it on other people, to say that you were just reacting to the way that they were acting. But that's not what Moses did. Moses, being a man who was humble, the Bible tells us the most humble man that had ever walked the earth, realized what he did was his responsibility, realized what he did was his fault. It was his own lack of trust. And we don't see a creation of bitterness. We don't see him turning on the Israelites. Instead, we see him continually taking care of the people all the way to the water's edge. We see him building into Joshua, the one who would take his place. He didn't turn to Joshua and say, you know what, man, this is a raw deal. I'm sorry that you're the one getting the next part of this. That God, he's not faithful. He'll dangle these promises out for you, but he's not going to come through with them. He's going to tell you things are going to be great, this promised land. You're not really going to get to go there. You're just going to do all the heavy lifting and the grunt work until you get there, dealing with these people's attitudes, and then poof, it's all going to be gone someday. That's not what he said. Instead, the way he closes things out with the Israelites is he composes this song for them that basically talks all about where God has taken them from Egypt all the way to present day. A historical song that speaks of God's faithfulness despite their unfaithfulness, and God's faithfulness to him as well. You see, even though he wasn't getting what he most desired, he saw that God's faithfulness had not changed one bit. And so when he turns to Joshua, what he tells him isn't God is unfaithful. He tells him, you're the next one to lead this. And I want you to know God is faithful, that he is going to be with you every step of the way, and that what you need to do is you need to be strong and courageous. You need to be brave and not give way to fear, not give way to disappointment, because that's exactly what the temptation is to give way to disappointment, to let that eat at you, to gnaw at you, and change every aspect of your life. Moses wasn't without fault, but after he fell, he got back up and he finished well. How are we going to finish? Maybe some of us haven't even started yet. Maybe God is putting us at the starting line. He's saying, run. Run after me, run with this community, and be an integral part of it. Learn to love each other. Learn to be a people of faith together. Learn to be a family together. And maybe some are farther along. Maybe some have more time in the rearview mirror than they do out the windshield. Their time is measured in years and months and weeks rather than in decades. And I think Moses' lesson is finished well. Bitterness can take hold, denial can take hold, but you have a trail of people who are following after you. Moses had an entire nation. You have families, you have friends who are all watching the way that you finish. Do you give way to the disappointment that you felt? I have to imagine Moses probably felt like the best years of his life were wasted in the desert. The first 40 he spent hiding, and the second 40 that he spent leading this obstinate people. And he could have felt like life was a waste. But instead, he took what he had left, and he finished tremendously well with it. He built into Joshua and encouraged him. He encouraged the people of God. And then God said, I want you to climb up to the top of Mount Nebo. And from this mountain vantage point, you can look over and you can see the promised land. You're not going to go, you're not going to set foot, but you'll get to see where I was taking them. You'll get to see that I was faithful. That's how I want each one of us to finish. There are inevitably going to be times in life when we fall. The question that's given to us is, will we get back up? Will we get back up, and will we start running again, only to fall again, only to get back up again? Victory is not found in never falling. Victory is found in getting up every time we do. You see, the people of Israel went from slaves of Egypt to slaves of fear. People who couldn't trust the faithfulness and goodness of God, even though they saw it day in and day out, sustaining them with food and water at every turn. We are not slaves to Egypt, but I think many of us are slaves to fear because we're afraid. We're afraid God isn't going to be enough. We're afraid God is going to put us in these situations that are going to destroy us, rather than put us in situations where he wants to use us for his glory. And it is easy when you get towards the end of life to get tired and think that it doesn't matter and think you're just going to skate, that now it's a young man or a young woman's game. But it's not. We have no guarantee of how many years we are going to be given. So all the more reason for us to use every single one of them for God's glory. And when you fall, which inevitably we will, come to the cross. God is no longer dealing with us with you sin, you die. He has now put that full judgment upon his Son at the cross, to where when we sin, we come to him and we find forgiveness in our time of need. And we find the strength of the Holy Spirit living inside of us, enabling us to stand up and go again. And when we're weak, we have the community to come around us and help us to get back up and run. I want to invite the worship team to come back up, because I think the song that we sang earlier, No Longer a Slave to Fear, really embodies what Moses went through, really embodies what the people of Israel were called to do, really embodies what Joshua was called to do after Moses. The spirit of fear that we are being set free from is sometimes our own expectations, our own hopes and dreams for our life that were never realized. Sometimes it's the hand we've been dealt with health or with bills or with broken relationships. And sometimes it's just a general disappointment in what we deal with on a daily basis. That's the fear we need to let go of and be brave enough to say, God, I'm going to play the hand that you've dealt me, and I'm going to play it to the best of my ability, and I am not going to allow the circumstances that I've dealt with every single day color what I do. I'm going to choose to be brave.